this? Oh, your hair was black before. Right.
Oh, no.
Dinner tonight. I'm going to the Algonquin thing.
How is this? Good, thank you. Hi, everybody. In case you didn't recognize that, that was the Chicago Women's Liberation Rock Band. And as you will see, Chicago is very well represented on this panel. So I realized that what I plan to say has been echoed throughout this conference, which is that to the extent that women's liberation has been covered by the historical narrative, it has mostly been about our ideas, which of course is wonderful since we had a lot of ideas. But our activism was also very important, and we had a different approach to activism from other organizations who worked more inside the institutions. I think there was good cross-fertilization, but this panel is going to talk specifically about women's liberation approach to activism, which involves organizing large groups of women to experience a sense of collective power and to challenge institutions from outside, and also to sustain a revolutionary vision. So all of us are going to talk about how various organizations did that. So 4 of our panelists are from Chicago, and we're going to talk about the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, which was organized in order to coordinate the various activist groups in the city. So we're going to start with Chris Riddiough, who's going to talk about a lesbian organizing project in the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. She is writing a book about the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, and she is also the vice chair of the Democratic Socialists of America. Then we're going to move to Heather Tobis Booth, who was also active before the creation of the CWLU at the University of Chicago, in Starting Jane, in the West Side Group, and then as a founding member in the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. Today, she consults with many groups, including right now, she's advising the immigration reform movement. Vivian Rothstein, also a founder of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, is going to talk specifically about the Women's Liberation School. Vivian was also in the West Side Group and a founder of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, which was modeled on the Women's Union in Vietnam, whose representatives she met on a visit to Vietnam. Then Heather is going to return to read something written by Naomi Weisstein, who was part of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, a founding member, and a founder of the Chicago Women's Liberation Rock Band. She has been in her bed for the last 34 years, a victim of a neurological disease, but she really wanted to contribute to this panel, so she read something which Heather is going to read. And when Heather says I, she means Naomi. Then we're going to move out of Chicago, and first up is Boston, and Demita Frazier is going to talk about the activism of the Combahee River Collective. She also has some connections to Chicago,
Always.
Where she...
I'm from Chicago, don't ever forget it.
She was involved in the student boycott and at desegregating Chicago schools. She's been an activist since 1966. And and involved in that. She's going to talk about the Combahee River Collective, which most of us know from their theory, their statement, but they also had an activist dimension that she's going to talk about. And then I am Amy Kesselman. And I was involved in the Chicago Women's Liberation Union for a year or 2 years. I was also in the West Side group. And then I moved away. And I'm now writing a history of women's liberation in New Haven because, as several speakers have mentioned, the local history is the way we're going to make women's liberation visible. So we are going to start now. And then we hope to have a lively conversation with you all. So I'll start with Chris.
Thank you. The Chicago Women's Liberation Union was formed in 1969. The political principles of the Women's Union stated that the struggle for women's liberation is a revolutionary struggle, and went on to link that struggle to those of other oppressed people. To advance women's liberation, CWLU focused on activism, organizing, and outreach. That activism was guided by an understanding of the need to recognize and combat sexism, and as a necessary part of this, to empower women as individuals and collectively. CWLU was made up of work groups oriented towards specific projects and chapters, a cross between consciousness-raising groups and political strategy groups. In April 1971, the Midwives chapter proposed and CWLU adopted what came to be known as the Juliet Mitchell chart, which, oh, they turned off my slides. Oh, well. I'll describe it. So the Women's Union adopted this chart called the Juliet Mitchell chart, which was based on the pamphlet The Longest Revolution by Juliet Mitchell. She was a British socialist feminist who emphasized the importance of having a multifaceted approach to feminism. And the chart was used as a guide to our organizing. It defined the areas of struggle which would be the focus of women's union programs. These were the 4 major roles that oppress women. First is our role in production, second is reproduction, third is sexuality, and fourth is our role as socializers of children. The second dimension of the chart shows the 3 aspects of struggle: service, education, and direct action. In developing programs in these areas, we wanted to involve women who had not previously been politically active, and we wanted to mobilize women to change the relations of power. The work of the lesbian group is an example of how that chart was used. The Women's Union started to address gay and lesbian issues early on through Liberation School, a women's union project that Vivian's going to talk more about. Then in 1972, the lesbian group proposed that CWLU adopt a position paper on lesbianism and socialist feminism, along with an amendment to the political principles in support of gay and lesbian rights. The paper started by noting that, quote, to understand how women's oppression and gay people's oppression are related to each other, and to discover the relationship of lesbianism to the women's movement, we need a deeper understanding of the structure and functioning of our society. In this paper, we want to examine these questions from our perspective as socialist feminists. It then went on to describe, using the areas of oppression from the Mitchell chart, the intersection between women's oppression and that of lesbians and gay men. At the end of the paper, a strategy for organizing on LGBT issues is discussed in the context, again, of the Mitchell chart. The paper outlined an extensive effort to incorporate lesbian issues into the educational, service, and action programs. It suggested including such discussions in Women and Their Bodies courses in Liberation School. The Women's Liberation as a Lesbian Plot course was given in a number of sessions. The Speakers Bureau set up talks in high schools and community groups on the nature of women's oppression, and these, it was urged, should include a discussion of lesbian and gay issues. Womankind, the Women's Union outreach paper, had already included articles on lesbians and continue to do so. The major service programs were the Health Project and the Legal Clinic. The Health Project, we thought, had the potential to expand into areas of more concern to lesbians, such as gynecological exams and referrals. The legal clinic could also take on lesbian rights cases. It was felt that developing a direct action strategy around gay issues was more difficult. The situation of gay people was different from that of most other oppressed peoples, since so many gay people were fearful of being openly identified as gay. Following the passage of the political principle in the position paper, the lesbian group began organizing. That organizing took two primary approaches: work within the lesbian community and work in the broader Chicago community in support of gay and lesbian rights. We used the Mitchell chart to design our actions. Our work in the lesbian community was the fun part of our organizing. We got to go to the Lost and Found bar and play pool, or to Augie's bar and dance. During the summer months, we played on Augie's softball team. And in the course of these activities, we distributed our newsletter, Blazing Star, and talked with people about socialist feminism and the importance of getting involved in the movement. The group also supported gay rights through education and action. Members were involved in efforts to pass gay rights legislation in the Chicago City Council and participated in the Illinois Gay and Lesbian Task Force. We organized petition drives and stood outside grocery stores to collect signatures. We did interviews with newspapers and on the radio. All of these activities may seem mundane today, but 40 years ago, they were very risky. Blazing Star continued its work even after the CWLU disbanded. We joined the New American Movement as a chapter and continued our organizing efforts. We worked with other groups to advance gay rights legislation. Individually, we also continued our work, joining the staff of NOW, leading labor unions, organizing in the LGBT community. This is the legacy of the Women's Union, the organizing and activism it generated during its existence, and the people it touched who continue that work. Thank you.
Sisterhood is blooming, and springtime will never be the same. That was the saying on a women's liberation graphics collective that Estelle Carroll helped to convene in CWLU. And it is how I felt about those early, heady days of the women's liberation movement, the CWLU. It's how I feel about this conference, and we all thank Deborah Bell, can't thank her enough, and Jay Ho and the others who are part of the team. And it is certainly how I feel about my sisters on this panel. What a reunion! To understand how amazing early women's liberation was, and the Chicago Women's Liberation Union was, CWLU, it's important, I want to give a little story about what life was like that we each remember in our own way before women's liberation. At my college, a friend of mine was raped at knife point in her bed in off-campus housing. We went with her to student health to get a gynecological exam. And she was told that student health didn't cover gynecological exams and was given a lecture about promiscuity. Of course, we sat with her. They called it a sit-in. And because people have organized relentlessly, of course women can now get coverage from student health for all gynecological functions, and that is part of what we've organized for, what we've won. Now, we also have a long way to go. There's a pushback on those gynecological services, a pushback on abortion, on women's health, on women overall. But we make this progress when we organize. CWLU was always committed to building both a vision and organizing. We had home groups that were a place for reflection on the society, on our work and on ourselves. And we had work groups that were a place for carrying out action. And then in some places, we had larger organizations that we supported, often helped to create and support. We believed we both needed a political home and for internal reflection, and also the planning and developing strategic mass-based organizations. Several of us wrote a strategy paper, and I realize Robin Kaufman's here, who's one of the people who helped write this, called Socialist Feminism, that we shared around the country. and we argued might be a basis for organizing around 3 principles. The first, which we still think are resonant, the first is to actually win concrete victories that improve people's lives, in addition to the abstract and important discussions, but so that people have more funding, clean air, a school they can send their kids to without fear. Second is that you give women a sense of their own power through their organizing, the direct action component. And 3, that we change the relations of power by holding those in power more accountable with structural reforms and build our own organizations. We then applied those 3 principles in action. One of the groups that I helped to create on these principles was the Action Committee for Decent Childcare, ACDC. Get it? We were inclusive. Right? I was a young mother with 2 kids, one born in '68 and one in '69. There was no publicly funded childcare in Chicago, but millions of women were returning to the workforce or entering the workforce, both to make a living for their families and to find work that was meaningful for them. They needed childcare. We tried to set up a childcare center that finally, when it was set up, we called it the Sojourner Truth Childcare Center. But we found that the city licensing was designed to protect 2 large contractors for their own profit and not for children, nor for small operators of such centers. We had to make 32 stops in order to get a license. One sent us to another, who sent us to another, who sent us back to the first. And there were rules like you couldn't build a childcare center in a below grade, land grade, which meant that a church basement, for example, was not allowed. But those were the very kinds of places that would be feasible for such a center. So we decided to organize on childcare, and with 2 friends, Day Creamer, who's now Day Piercy, and Kate Blunt, we set up a new organization. What we wanted was free 24-hour client-controlled childcare.
Yeah.
We wanted, and specifically, and we want it now. Specifically, we wanted a revision of the child care licensing laws. We wanted services overseen by parents and child care operators, not bureaucrats, and we wanted funding, at least $1 million, we said, which then was an outrageous amount of money, it seemed, for child care. The organizations had thousands of supporters, over 500 hardcore activists, nearly 50% white and 50% African American, and in those days, there wasn't a large Latino population in the city. We held hearings around the city. This was organizing, not just taking those who were already committed. We found people who cared and needed childcare. In one Lithuanian community, a neighborhood that someone said thought they lost World War II. Think about it for a minute. Yeah. Lithuanian community. A political council member brought the John Birch Society to the hearing to argue against government control. We had a packed audience in a local church. The council member then attacked me as someone who starts by asking for childcare and then forces abortions on women who are not good mothers for their kids. One woman stood up and in a strong Lithuanian accent said, "Mrs. Boot, I follow you on childcare, but don't force me to have an abortion." As someone who was Jewish and had started Jane, the abortion counseling service, I wasn't sure if I would get out of there alive. Then another woman stood up and with tears in her eyes said to the council member and the whole group, "You know I am a good mother, but I have to work to support my kids since my husband was killed in Vietnam." The audience rose in applause for her. We turned the evening around and found many who joined the organization and many who stood with us for action. That is organizing. A key part of the organizing was to help women gain confidence in their own leadership. And so in early action, we had gathered about 30 mothers and their children down to City Hall to meet with a person who should have been in charge of childcare, but there was no position really in charge of childcare. We had been asking for something that we felt they had to give us. we said, could you give us a study about the childcare that exists and what the needs are? It was hard to refuse that specific demand, an initial demand. But we received no response, so we brought the mothers and their children down to the City Hall department. Now, these were women who often never left their neighborhood without their husband, and many never left without their husband's permission. We had the meeting scheduled with the department head, but she didn't show up, so we waited. 30 women and their children, their toddlers, gets a little antsy. We started by singing "Row, row, row your boat." We then moved on to "We Shall Not Be Moved." The women were gaining confidence. Kids needed a diaper change. We were a little embarrassed at first. Then we decided to gather them up and say, "They've given us the poop. We're going to give it to them." And the women found a new voice and became bolder. The kids started looking through the files. And at first we said, "No, don't do that. These are their files." Then we realized these files should belong to us. We looked through the files and found the basis of a study that we had been asking for all along. At that point, we called the press. The press shows up. The woman who's the head of the department comes in the other door and says, "Oh, I'm so surprised. I didn't know you were waiting for me." And she agreed to community hearings all around the city that allowed us to have another place in which we could organize. And after an 8-month struggle, in which it was also raised as one of the 2 leading issues in the governor's race that was going on at the same time, we won. A child care licensing review board reviewing the city code, and did review it to make it more child care and child and family friendly. It would be composed 50% of parents and 50% of child care operators, and we won $1 million of city funds for child care, which in 1970 was real money. It was amazing. That is organizing and women's power. And out of it, we had wonderful leaders develop, many of whom stayed active on childcare, and some of whom became active on other issues, again, across race and class. When we organize, we can change the world, but only when we put our ideas into action and organize. There were many challenges. There were many conflicts. There was an ending of the CWLU, but in these early years, combining organizing and theory, we said with pride, sisterhood is blooming, and springtime will never be the same.
Awesome.
It was mentioned that when we organized the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, we wanted to create a political home and an organizational home for us and for all the women in Chicago who were looking for women's liberation. And there's a whole bunch of people from Chicago here, so I just wanted you to stand up because this story is really all of our stories. Hey. The Chicago of the mid-60s and early 70s was an extremely repressive city. It was highly segregated. It was under the control of the Richard J. Daley political machine. Even though there was a lot of community organizing going on in the city, it was impossible to win anything, even a crosswalk or a stop sign, unless you went to your ward committeeman. And there was incredible violence from the Chicago Police Department. There was a very active Red Squad that used to greet us by name when we went to public meetings. Fred Hampton, the Black Panther leader, had been killed in his bed by the Chicago police, in his home, in his bed, murdered. Many of the women that we knew and were friends of ours had been raped on the streets of Chicago. So it was not an easy place to live in. It still isn't, but for different reasons. We'll see the weather. But so when we started CWLU, we really wanted to create an inviting, pluralistic, welcoming organization that could reach into the neighborhoods of Chicago and invite people in, and also a place where we could do our work and we could have a voice. And as I was preparing my thoughts for this panel, I started looking through some of the position papers that we wrote in those days. We were so serious and so smart and so dedicated. And it reminded me that many of us who had come out of community organizing and the civil rights movement and the peace movement, we had hit kind of a glass ceiling on the left. There was really no place to go with our sense of strategy and our vision for organizing. And so the women's movement and the Chicago Women's Liberation Union really did become our place. And women brought incredible talent and interest and smarts and strategic thinking. It was really very heady times and very exciting. So we did form this organization. We thought we had kind of discovered a movement. We turned around and realized there were hundreds and hundreds of women behind us in this wave of a social movement that we hadn't really created. I guess it was created by social conditions, various conditions that had been analyzed, but there was all this energy. So we opened a CWLU office and we got many, many, many calls. Many of them were for Jane, women looking for abortion services, but many of them were women just looking for the women's movement and other women to talk to. And so one of the first projects we started was the Liberation School for Women. This was well before there were any women's courses in colleges, about 9 years before the first women's studies meeting that had been held nationally in 1979. So we decided we're going to start offering introductory courses, introduction to women's liberation, the history of the family, our bodies, ourselves, women in literature. We also were going to offer skills classes like how to repair your own VW bug, which turned out to be the most popular class. Karate, how to organize, Lamaze classes. And then we had a third kind of class, which was these study groups, kind of study action groups. So women and religion was one of them. Racism and women's politics was another. Another was organizing high school women. And those had the potential to develop into programs. So it was one of the easiest organizing jobs I've ever had in our work group. We would put out a few leaflets and we'd get over 100 women. This was the very first session. The three or 6 months later, we put out a few leaflets. We got nearly 250 women. It was women just pouring out, looking for that energy, looking for some way to connect. So the school was run by a work group. Our work group had a representative on the steering committee of CWLU, as did all the other work groups, Jane, the Graphics Collective, Womankind, the newspaper. Every project had a representative, and then the expectation was that everyone would be in a consciousness-raising group, and each one of those had a representative. So we were decentralized and centralized, just to reference what Roz was talking about building a movement that was not totally centralized and had the energy of decentralization. We also tried to reach out to special groups, and we had extension classes in poorer neighborhoods to try to attract women who wouldn't necessarily come to the church basement where most of our classes were held on the north side. So we had classes near Wright Junior College. We had a class for older women, which Chris and I realized was for women who were about 40. We had classes for high school women. So many of us taught the classes, but then women came forward, wanted to teach the classes, and our students, we always did evaluations. Our students had suggestions for other classes. So it was very lively. I think at the height of the Liberation School, we had like 25 classes going on, 6-week sessions, $2 a class. It was a bargain. And it was all run completely by volunteers. In those days, there really were not nonprofit organizations with foundation support. This was done like entirely with volunteer labor. And so we had to charge a little bit. So the strength of the Liberation School, I think, was partly timing and partly our connection to the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. Because once you took a class at CWLU, you were told about all the projects that were going on in CWLU and also the mobilizations that were going on and the various actions. And the idea was that you would think about joining a work group, and that there would be a way for you to tie into the larger movement. Another strength of having this CWLU structure was that when we started to get requests for speakers, and we got lots and lots of requests for speaking engagements, we decided instead of just sending the people who were the most experienced and the most self-confident, that we were going to train each other, all of us, to speak. And so we used to run these workshops where we would share information about women's oppression, and we would give people the opportunity to practice speeches. And when those speaking gigs came in, those requests, they were filled on a rotating basis. And it was like a trial by fire, because you'd end up speaking, you know, it could be against a very famous person. I don't know if you remember Lionel Tiger. He was this major misogynist. I ended up having to debate him at Mundelein College, I think, or one Catholic college. Amy remembered having to speak at a Grant Park anti-war rally where she was the only female speaker after like 10 or 15 men. So it was our commitment really to building leadership and building confidence and the visibility of all women. I think we couldn't have done that without the strength of the CWLU. So I just want to say I think that what we built in Chicago was a unified movement. We didn't demand that everybody had the same strategy or the same priorities, but we did expect people to talk with each other and dialogue with each other and together build something that was so much larger than any of us could have built individually. So thank you.
Remember now, I'm channeling, nearly impossible, but I'm channeling Naomi Weisstein. These are her words. In Chicagoland in 1970, almost every teenage girl listened to rock. They considered it their music, hormonal, quasi-outlaw, with screaming guitars and heavy driving beat. But it was so misogynist. This wasn't the Beatles' playful, women-affectionate songs. These were vicious boy bands. The guitarists stood with their legs spread wide, pretending to fuck their guitars, while we sang about how stupid girls were and how they were good for nothing but sex and often rape. We loved those songs. All our lives, we girls had been taught that male abuse was sexy. But this stuff was cultural carpet bombing of girls, based on the amplified idea that brutal equaled sexy. Wow, shiver. How could a feminist combat this? As a beginning jazz pianist, which Naomi was, and a stand-up comedian, and an ardent member of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, I, this is Naomi, decided to form a women's liberation rock band. That's how. It would have us singing about how smart, strong, hip we were, and how we would have sex only on our terms, thank you. And we'd get so good that soon we'd saturate the airwaves, inundating teenage girls with a new kind of musical culture, joyful, playful, funny, and taking no shit from anyone. Sort of like the much later, more recent Pussy Riot. On International Women's Day in 1970, we played our first gig in a band shell in Chicago, in Grant Park. It was a disaster. We regrouped and retooled. Naomi insisted we had a boffo comedy, along with setting our music to serious feminist poems. We did our second gig at a New Left coffee house, Alice's Restaurant. The audience exploded with joy. Whew. They clapped and cheered and shouted. They picked up the words to some of our choruses and sang and danced to the music. And after we finished, they mobbed the stage, hugging us and crying. They had their music. In the following 3 years, we made tours of the Northeast and far west is Colorado, playing to ecstatic audiences. For example, at a Y camp in Michigan for inner-city pre-teenage girls, they repeated the lyrics to a song Amy Kesselman wrote, the VD Blues, and singing and bopping, they made us play it 3 times over before they'd let us move on. At Cornell, where we played with our sister New Haven rock band, women stripped to the waist, held hands, and danced in a huge circle, even though we had heard that a fraternity had threatened to destroy the event. A New Haven vocalist sang out, "Put your shirts on, sister. We're in grave danger under this threat." "No," they shouted. "We're free. We won't go back. We won't." This happened again and again in different forms in the 3 years that we performed. However, there were catastrophes. The most comical of these was at the second annual Third World Drag Queen Ball. Out of the blue, a male voice identifying himself as Ortiz, Third World Revolutionary, phoned me to invite the band to perform, and I said, "Of course we will," thrilled. We got to the ball on the far south side of Chicago and swiftly realized that we were going to be out-bazzazzed. Tall, gorgeous black men in glittering red ball gowns and Diana Ross wigs were lip-syncing to their recordings, which were being played at top volume. When we took the stage with our politically correct scruffiness and feeble amplification, we resembled supplicants at a Salvation Army catfish breakfast for the homeless. We played 2 songs and then quit. No one was listening. They had no idea why we were there. A dispirited Ortiz and his partner, wearing identical one-piece pink wool bathing suits, clapped politely. We fled. But we thrived as a chapter under CWLU's tent. While we toured, we also played all over Chicago, wherever we were needed, by CWLU at conferences, dances, street demonstrations. We played and stayed. Recently, I saw for the first time an old photo of the band playing outside the Chicago Civic Center in the Loop, next to the Picasso sculpture. I noticed a row of CWLU women standing behind us, some with their arms crossed, like Elijah Muhammad's Fruit of Islam bodyguards. What were they doing there? The answer: they were acting as our bodyguards because it was an unruly crowd. I teared up. They were protecting the band, although we never asked them to, and we were performing because they wanted us to add festive vibes to their demonstration. Solidarity and sisterhood, a revolutionary moment.
From Naomi.
Well, glad I'm coming after you. 2 live wires. This story is going to be a little bit different, and for reasons that'll become readily apparent as I speak. In 1972, I made a decision with other women I was living with at the time to move to Boston. At the same time, an organization called the National Black Feminist Organization was being formed by women from New York, Chicago, and Detroit. Margaret Sloan, may she rest in peace, who was my housemate, had told us about NBFO forming before the group of us moved from Chicago to Boston. I moved to Boston with 5 women. We moved to Boston because we wanted to become political activists in Boston, and I was one of 3 African-American women in that household. Margaret knew that we were going to end up organizing NBFO in Boston and charged me to be one of the people to help bring people together to do that. And ironically, the women who initially came together to form NBFO came from places like Cleveland, New Haven, Chicago, and we were all strangers to one another. We had all been involved in various political activities and organizations, whether we were democratic socialists, whether we were anti-war activists, civil rights activists. We had all had some experience organizing with other people, primarily men and women, in a variety of settings. When we came together to form NBFO in Boston, it was a group of women, and the names some are well known and some are not. Barbara Smith, Beverly Smith, Demita Frazier, several people who are now lost to history, some of whom have passed on. Ellie Johnson, Mercedes Tompkins, who I hope to see here today, but she's not. Several women, we all came together in my living room in Dorchester, in Codman Square, and we formed the National Black Feminist Organization, Cadre, in Boston. After meeting for 4 months and talking extensively, we figured out that we probably weren't the right women to form NBFO, because NBFO at that time was really a much more mainstream organization that was focusing on issues that didn't involve analyzing the economy, looking at class, looking at issues that really we saw as we were thinking of ourselves as having a radical approach. In June of 1975, we wrote a letter to the organizers of the National Black Feminist Organization and said that we were seceding. And we were going to form what we considered to be a radical black feminist organization for which Barbara Smith found the name for, the Combahee River, which is in, which is in the South, and this was the location of an insurrection led by Harriet Tubman, where not 390, but merely 65 slaves were freed and taken on the Underground Railroad to the north. Amazing. We were women who represented the wide spectrum of sexuality, of class, of color, and economics. We were middle class, working class, and upper class black women. We were women without any educational privilege at all, women who were lesbian, women who were bisexual, and women who were straight. Our intent from the very beginning of our organization was that we wanted to have an analysis of black women's situation in the New World, and we included women in our organization from what we described as the African diaspora, so in the New World. So in that sense, we were also considering ourselves quite radical because we had Afro-Latina women in our organization. We had women who were coming from the Africanized Philippines. Take that in for a moment. We actually had women who were Afro-Mexican. We were very diverse along those lines. We had made a commitment, and before the Combahee River statement was written and published in the Socialist Feminist, who remembers the title of that book? I can't remember, but socialist feminism was big during that time period, and we were invited, I'm sorry? I can't, yeah, you know, the title is lost in the sauce, but in any event, thank you, thank you. Thank you. That's right. Now, thank you. Conditions, of course. The thing I want to say, though, is that prior to writing that statement, we had run in the Women's Center. Libby Bouvier is here. She was so helpful to us because Libby was helping to run the Women's Center. Weren't you the chief woman? We always thought you were. All right. Well, the point is, we ended up meeting for several years before that statement was written, and we ran consciousness-raising groups. We put out the word in the African-American community in Boston that we were organizing as black feminists, and we wanted to invite as many African-American women and women from the African diaspora to come and join with us to talk about the specific conditions that we were finding unique to our experience as black women. I look back with some bittersweet feelings about the Chicago Women's Liberation Union because I was one of the African-American women who was involved in Jane. And I was quite young at that point, but I was very committed at that point to making sure that there was a connection being made for women of color who were having abortions from the South Side. So, in any event, yes. We have 5 minutes each, so I'm going to contain myself because we could really go on and on. The thing that was most important in terms of organizing in Boston that we quickly came to understand is that Boston, like Chicago, was a heavily segregated city. The African American community, for those of us who were from a city with a much larger African American population, were shocked at the nature of the interactions amongst African American people and the African American community in the larger Boston scene. Boston, when we moved here, was in the midst of the busing crisis. There were tremendous rifts between groups of people in this town. We decided, we weren't from here, so we weren't going to be restricted by any of that. And we proceeded, as only you can do when you're young and fresh, to go out to the churches, to the local clinics, to the daycare centers, to bring the word that black feminism was real, that black women had a right to organize around issues that pertained to our particular condition, and that we thought it was important to organize women. Many of us were lesbians and bisexual women who chose to stay in our communities and organize in our communities because from our perspective, as African American women, we had every single right to do so. And we were going to stand up for the health and well-being of all black women. Naturally, this had its ups and downsides. Someone should have made the film a long time ago of some of the experiences that we had going to the churches particularly. Since none of us were churched, as we say in the black community, we were oftentimes confronted with people who questioned our legitimacy. Sadly for them, we were already completely authentic and we knew who we were, so we weren't having that. We organized around specific issues in Boston that we thought were important for African American women. Violence against women was our key. It was one of the most important issues that we felt that was really important for us to look at. And I'll talk a bit about an experience that we had organizing around the murders of several black women in Boston. But we were concerned about domestic violence, reproductive rights, economic issues in terms of what it was like for black women living in the city, and we were very, very committed to coalition work. We worked with an array of organizations in Boston, and we believed that it was important for building a mass movement. Remember that phrase, mass movement? We thought that the only way that we were going to accomplish some of the things that we wanted to accomplish for African American women was by working with all sorts of groups in the city. So we marched on the picket line with Chuck Turner when African American and Latino men were trying to make inroads into the unions in this town because the unions were lily white and were really trying, who said still is? Maryland. We felt that it was important also to bring heat and light to the idea that for women who wanted to be involved in the unions, someone had to step up and say, we needed a place there, and we did that. When I talk about our activism, I think about the particular issues the issue that we focused on that was sort of foisted upon us by circumstance. In 1979, first 3, then 6, then 9, then 11, then 15, then 22, and finally 27 black women were murdered in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan in a 4-month period of time. I'll never forget being in Barbara's apartment when we did the first brochure that we took and distributed all across the city to get people to come out and march with us to protest the murders of these black women. We initially got a few women. Then as we started working more with many of the organizations that were in Boston, which were feminist organizations, we put the call out and held a series of community meetings in Jamaica Plain, in Roxbury, and in Cambridge and Somerville to get more people involved in the work that we were doing. And finally, when we got up to about 27 black women being murdered, we had an enormous meeting in Jamaica Plain where we had yet another negative encounter with African American men who were part of the black nationalist movement in Boston, who tried to take the meeting over and teach us. You know that didn't go well, right? That did not end well. In fact, what that did is it was covered by the Globe, and it spurred us to have yet another march to talk about the importance of confronting any organization that would choose to come in and attempt to usurp our power. One of the largest marches in Boston was held shortly thereafter. We picketed and we marched to Mayor White's house on the flats of Beacon Hill and held a rally there. And for reasons which are not clear to me, the murders stopped in that number. Again, I don't know if it was because we brought information, light to it, et cetera, but what we did learn through that experience was that Boston continued to be a place where Black people as a group and Latino people as a group at that point were still without any serious political clout. I believe that remains true today. It is still a very sketchy situation for people of color in this town, despite the fact that we are a minority city. I want to say one of the best things that happened for us as a group of African American women organizing in this city was that we empowered, through consciousness raising groups that we held over the 7 years that we were around, probably a couple of thousand women. We had, on average, about 60 to 70 women coming to the Women's Center when we would hold focus groups, holding consciousness raising groups. We had women come from as far as the Seychelles Islands off the coast of Africa who came, 2 students as a matter of fact, one at BU, one at Northeastern, who came and then took back and sent us photographs of them holding up our statement in front of a meeting that they had of women on the Seychelles, which who even knew what those were? We had women coming from Germany, we had women coming from New York, coming and meeting with us to talk about the issue of Black feminism, which remains controversial today. It's astounding to me that we're still arguing about the importance, about the legitimacy, about the existence of Black feminist theory and Black feminism. I could go on, but I want to just say one more thing before I come to an end, because we were successful in organizing, but we were also, in a bittersweet way, really undermined by the lack of numbers. We had many women come through our organization. We also had a split along the lines of sexuality and sexual orientation. We thought of it as a split at the time, but really we should have really looked at it more closely and realized we were fomenting revolution. Other feminist, Black feminist groups spun off from Combahee. Some lasted brief periods of time, some lasted longer. Someone said to me when we were talking about doing this panel, or I was invited to do this panel, that we were talking about the past and really that moment in time, and I'm a believer in the moment is now. I'm not a nostalgist. I really treasure the time that I spent organizing with other African American feminists in this city. But what I see is the trail, like a comet, of all the women who came through that organization and who went out and diffused that power in organizations that they ran. We helped women empower themselves to think about the importance of Black women's power. Those women, we were strengthened to go on and to lead other organizations to do pretty wonderful things. And I guess what I would say is going forward, I'm really invested in young women today. I've been meeting via phone and Skype with a group of young Black feminists in Philadelphia. It's inspirational. They are struggling with the exact same issues that we struggled with 40 years ago. Still, legitimacy, visibility, et cetera. But I have to say to you, they're there. They're in New York, they're in Oakland, they're in Chicago, they're in Rutland, Vermont, they're everywhere. That's my hope, is that what we did is we created in that moment an opportunity for young women to really be able to take their power and use that power for the benefit of all Black women and obviously for the world. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to talk briefly about an organization in New Haven, Connecticut, which shared a lot of the same approaches to activism that we have talked about. And this is a group that called itself Women versus Connecticut. There was a slide of their recruitment poster with a woman where they they raised her fist up in a sign of positive resistance. It was an organization that challenged Connecticut's abortion laws. And what they did, I think what radical feminists and women's liberation activists with roots in the New Left were very suspicious of using the system. So this group tried to find a way to both use litigation against the Connecticut abortion law as a way of building a mass movement. And as they tried to, and also to educate women, not only about their rights to control their reproductive lives, but about women's liberation in general. They were extremely successful in a number of ways. They had a powerful effect on the judges who dealt with their lawsuit in 2 separate cases. The judges who wrote the opinions, which then were on their way to the Supreme Court when Roe v. Wade was decided. These judges were educated about how the abortion law affected women's lives because this organization brought women's experience to the forefront, not doctors' experience, but women's experience. In the courtroom, they testified about how the abortion laws affected their lives. And so one of the judges, for example, said in his opinion that, in fact, the devastating effects of the abortion laws on women's lives meant that the laws needed to be abolished. And he talked also about the importance of women gaining equality and the fact that without control of our reproductive lives, women's equality remained illusory. That idea found itself into the opinion in Roe v. Wade. So they were successful in affecting the eventual outcome. They were also successful in changing public opinion. Actually, after they were organizing for about 2 years, the public opinion in Connecticut was more favorable to women having the right to decide about abortion than the national polls demonstrated. They built a very powerful movement, but they also wanted very badly to connect this particular issue with the rest of their critique of women's position in society. So they went around the state and with their plaintiff recruitment pamphlet, and this pamphlet was a general critique of patriarchy and capitalism. They did not use those words, but they explained the ways that living in this society made it impossible for women to control our lives, and that reproductive freedom was one part of our struggle. But they found themselves less and less able to talk about those kinds of connections as they were reaching out beyond their own circles. So, for example, one woman organizer, and many of these activists were also law students, and this woman said, after she came back from talking to a group of Democratic women in Darien, Connecticut, an affluent town, she said, well, if you don't know what's wrong with the whole political system in this state, then you can't change the fact that the legislature is going to screw around on abortion and women generally, and also all the other things we believe in because of the way it's set up. It was hard and harder and harder to talk about how it all goes together. So I think one of the sort of problems that confronted a lot of women's liberation groups as they tried to develop programs was how to sustain a radical critique of women's position in society at the same time as building movements around single issues. So this is an example of a movement that was successful in building a movement, but less successful in making a connection for those women between that issue and other issues in women's lives. And I think that that is a problem that a lot of women's liberation groups experienced. So, we would like to hear from you. With that, yes, Ross? What? Go ahead.
The question was, the Women's Union sounds so amazing, how did it end? Okay. It goes on in our spirit today.
It's why we're so successful in the country.
Yes. Well, actually, there are a couple of us here who were on a committee that folded up the Women's Union. And I mean, there's a lot that could be said about this. But one of the things that did happen was that over time, various what I call ultra-left groups came in and decided that they had the correct line about everything, essentially, and decided, and what we wound up doing, I look back and I think we should just say, no, you don't have the correct line any more than we do. This is a discussion among people, but what we did was we actually spent a lot of energy trying to debate them in a way that, I mean, they were basically religious fanatics. You could not have a debate with them. We could not have a discussion. And so we were wasting a lot of energy. And after about 5 of these different groups came in, it basically drained us. And we decided that rather than letting some organization like that take over, that we were going to disband the organization. That was a better course than going down some other road. And it was a very wrenching move, but we decided that, you know, better to make a clean break and disband and then go on and do other activism. I mean, the other thing, of course, that factored in at the end was that it was getting to the point where this was 1977 that it ended, that the right wing was upsurging, I don't think that's a word, but something like that, and that it was getting increasingly hard to fight that off. In Illinois, there was a big move on the ERA, and a lot of people got involved in that. But I do think that the ultra-left groups played an extremely negative role in the organization and probably in other organizations around the country.
Yes.
There are 2 comments I wanted to say on it as sort of lessons I feel we can learn for today. One is that as there were increasingly internal struggles, the external organizing didn't take on the same vitality as it needed to. It was also true you didn't want to bring the new people you were bringing in into this internal fight. But it was constantly the need to build external organizing. Look externally, what were you there for? And remember why you founded. The second is that for all the division and conflict we may have with each other as we're trying to figure out what to do, being gentle with each other, caring for each other, and remember sisterhood really is important, even with the conflicts we may find, and to avoid the kind of problems that Joe Freeman describes in a devastating article called Trashing, about what happened to people when they came under this attack. And remember that we are so much stronger together and have so much more in common. And together can change the world.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
I have a little information about it, not huge about it. I was there, I heard, but I don't remember much. Were you there? Do you remember who went?
We sent 2 people.
Was the conference paper the same as the
No. It was published before, and that wasn't the first time.
The question was, the Combahee River Collective was represented at the Socialist Feminist Conference in Yellow Springs in 1975, and so the question was for Demita to talk about that.
So quickly, I can tell you that there was a small presentation that Barbara made. Barbara and another woman went to the conference, and at that point, we were in second draft with the statement. It wasn't the final draft of that statement. So Barbara went, presented what was in the paper at that point, to much acclaim. People loved it, but that was it. And there was not, at that point, our focus was only to get the word out, not necessarily to, it was 1975, we were just beginning, so it was just to sort of get the word out. But it was, we were focusing more on the speaking that we were doing in New England at colleges and universities at that point, so it was just one of many that we were doing at that time. You're welcome.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to make an observation about the issue of when, I wanted to make an observation about the issue of when the union basically decided to close down. And I'm from Chicago, and I was in another organization besides that one that also closed down at the same time. And I also think something was happening generationally and historically, that the war had ended. And I think that there was, even though organizing was going on in many areas that weren't directly involved with the war, that fueled a certain energy and prioritization that kept people going. And I think also that, and a focus somehow. And then the other thing that was happening is, I think people were getting a little older. I mean, to me, it's like going from 22 to 25, but I mean, it was, and so I think that there were other things pulling at people's lives and other interests, and I think that made our energy then was even more dispersed by this internal fighting going on.
Yes.
I just wanted to say when CWLU folded, the women who were still in the organization donated all the archives to the Chicago Historical Society. So for anyone in this room who's a student who would like to research any of this, there's class sign-up lists from the Liberation School. There's agendas for all our citywide meetings. All that rich material is there for you.
Other comments? We have 5 minutes. Yes.
Just a quick announcement in terms of that. There is a website, in case you don't know it, started by a bunch of us in the CWU. It's called CWLUHerStory.org, I guess, and there are tons of old documents and interviews, and it's a great resource for students.
Okay, I'll repeat that. There is a website called cwlu.org where you herstory.org, where you can find a sampling of these documents. Yes.
Yeah, also in terms of the breakup of the CWLU, following up on what Chris said, many people had moved in different directions by that point, so it wasn't as strong and as vibrant at the point where these other things came. I, for one, and Heather and a number of other people, had moved towards now. We had discovered that, or I'll speak for myself, that here was a national organization with people out in Podunk, Iowa, working on the same issues. And so, what?
They had improved somehow.
And right, and it didn't fit our image of the upper middle class woman, but they were in fact working on very real economic issues, and we felt.
And Mary Jean Collins is here, one of the great leaders of NOW. The organization would have even been stronger with her leadership.
Yes, one more question.
Hi, my name is Angela. Thanks, y'all. It was very good to hear about it from other people's experience.
Can you talk louder?
I said it was really great to hear about a time that I lived through from other people's perspective. You know, I'm a little nervous to bring this up because I have often in my life, when I do bring this up about race and racism, eyes are rolled and like, oh God, we have to bring it up again. And I remain really, really concerned
Thank you. Thank you.
Somebody, would you like to
I
respond?
also wanted to I hate to use the word piggyback, but, and also, I don't actually want to speak to this. I realized something. No. There's a reason, there's a method to my madness. The woman that's sitting here on the end, she had a question. Can we take one more question?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
To say that I'm part of a group that started in 1973 to do anti-violence work, rape crisis work, and transitionist work in Canada. But it's from this tradition. I didn't come from that tradition. I started at 27 and 43. Been doing it for a while. But I know that the in-movements, we called it the in-movement struggles in where we were, because everybody had them. Everybody had them. So my question is, I'm now taking on that organization. I hope to be there for the rest of my life. And the women who started it are now gone. So they're from your tradition of the late 60s and 70s. And I want to know, there's lessons to be learned from you about how to keep going. I don't only want to know why you shut down, but I want to know how to continue on. Absolutely. This is a tradition that speaks the most to me.
Absolutely.
So I need to know a little bit more from you. How do I keep going? I have two suspicions. One is that a lot of women moved into institutions and left the street organizing, which I'm obviously very resentful of. So I'm saying it all day. But anyway, so I think there needs to be more of an integration of that. I know that's a problem, both in the States and in Canada. But I also think there's also other lessons from you. What would you have done differently if you could do some of it again?
I have to speak to this really quickly, just because
This is a great way to end it.
Exactly. Amy and I were talking about this very issue. The importance of intergenerational sharing and of the women of our generation making sure that we make the connection with younger activist feminists who are continuing to organize around the very same issues, many of them that we were bringing up. I cannot tell you how important it is. I'm glad that you said that, because I really, like I said, I'm not nostalgic. I believe in the now. What are we doing to share our wisdom, our experiences, what we did wrong so that you don't make the same errors, and to also celebrate what you're doing that's right. So I'm actually we're gonna be talking about this going forward. I haven't got the idea yet, but I really find there needs to be a venue, a road show, a something, where we go and we really do that circle sharing, and we really share the organizational principles that worked, the developmental issues that work, the ways in which we need to get over ourselves, those of us who are at the other edge of time, and not look at these young women who are organizing now, because they're organizing in a very different environment, under very different, more heinous circumstances than we did. And we need to strengthen one another. We are not going to live forever. So we need to impart this information, these stories, and believe it or not, we could probably learn some things. So
Yes.
Yes.
I want to add one thing that I think we can learn from the CWLU, which is, and that I think continues to be a challenge, which is to be understanding of difference and embracing of difference, and not allow differences to divide us. So, thank you.
Thank you all.
Sisterhood is still powerful.
Oh my God.
What?
Do you? We're 16.
Show you the best Ohio there is, which is perfect. But it's a